Good morning, 5th grade. Today we're going to continue reading in our Civil War text, and today's article is about everyone's war. So let's go ahead and complete our quick write. It says, describe a time when you were left out of an activity. What reasons were you given for being left out? How did you respond? All right, so press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the focus question. Today we want to know what is the main idea of the text and what role did foreigners and immigrants play in the Civil War. Our vocabulary words for today are prejudice, and that is the belief that you are better than someone because of your race or your achievements. Okay, and so this brown egg is experiencing prejudice from the white eggs. They are like being mean to him. You can look at their faces. The second word is immigrant, and that's a person who comes to live permanently from a foreign country. And this picture shows immigrants coming to the United States. The last word is minorities, and minority it's just a small number of a specific group, so it's less than half. Minority would be the opposite of majority. And so oftentimes minorities refers to people of color because there in the past have been less people of color than Caucasian people. All right. Let's turn the page, and we are on page 18 of our text, getting ready to read Everyone's War. And before we get started, we know that in a nonfiction text, we use the strategy of asking a how or why question about the title. And so we wouldn't say, why was it Everyone's War? Because we know it was a war between the states. But it makes sense to say, how was the Civil War everyone's war? And we would write that down in the first box. How was the Civil War everyone's war? And as we are reading, we're going to underline the answer to that question to help us get to the main idea. I'm at in the 1860s. Get ready to follow along. In the 1860s, some groups of people were discouraged from joining the Union and Confederate armies. And I underline that because right off the bat, I'm thinking, if some people were discouraged from joining, that doesn't mean it was everyone's war. If not everyone could participate, it wasn't everyone's war. Let's keep going. Native Americans were excluded from many volunteer regiments, and in the Northeast there was a lot of prejudice against members of immigrant groups. Men from these minorities formed their own volunteer regiments. Irishmen, Jews, Italians, and Germans enlisted in units made up of other patriotic immigrants. Native Americans fought in Indian outfits in both armies. The adventure of the Civil War also attracted professional soldiers from other countries who were called foreign observers. And so if I go back in what I underlined, I know that some people were discouraged from joining both armies, so they formed their own volunteer regiments. And those people that were discouraged were Native Americans and other immigrant groups. So if I go to my main idea, I would get ready to write, even though some groups were discouraged from joining the Union and Confederate armies, many of these minority groups formed their own volunteer regiments. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for number 2. And number 2 asks us to go to the Irish troops at Mass, and that is at the bottom of page 18. And we see a picture of a group of soldiers with what looks like a priest and a large cross by a tent. So it kind of looks like they are having a church service is what it looks like. Let's go to the caption. In the 1860s, most Americans were Protestant and were wary of different faiths. The Irish troops in this photograph had a Catholic priest as their chaplain. But members of one largely Jewish regiment in the Union Army were not allowed to have a rabbi as their spiritual leader. The war was nearly over before the Northern Army changed its rules. And so the first question asks us, what is the author saying? And the author is basically telling us that most people were Protestant who were in the army, and so they didn't really allow people to practice other religions. And so if we were writing down in 2A, I would say it was unusual for regiments to have a Catholic priest as their chaplain. Jewish regiments were not allowed to have rabbis until the war was almost over. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for 2B. And so we're thinking about what's the author doing, and thinking about why the author would include this picture and caption. And the author wants to give us an example of how a regiment of immigrants distinguished itself by having a Catholic priest as its chaplain. So that's the first reason. The author's showing us that these regiments could distinguish themselves or stand out by practicing a religion that was not as popular in that time. All right, the second part for part 2B, we could also say the author's explaining how regiments of different beliefs were discriminated against during the Civil War. All right, so if you were a religion that was not Protestant, if you were Catholic or Jewish, you were treated differently than a soldier who was Protestant. You weren't allowed to have a spiritual leader that agreed with your religion. You had to follow a spiritual leader who did not agree with your religion if you were in the army and you weren't Protestant. All right, so press pause to write down your answer for 2B and play when you're ready for number 3. We're looking for the picture and caption that says European observers, and that is at the bottom of page 19. It says, this photograph shows 3 titled French military men, the Duc de Chartres, the Prince de Unionville, and Comte de Paris. They all served with Union Major General George McClellan's staff in 1862. Okay, and so it's asking us, what is the author saying? And so if I'm going back, I know that European observers were men that had high rankings in the armies of their home countries. So soldiers from Europe, from other countries in Europe, came over to the United States to help fight in the Civil War. And if they did come, that means that's because they were high up in the military in their countries. So let's write down our answer for 3A. European observers were men that had high rankings in the armies of their home countries. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for 3B. And it asks us, what's the author doing? The author is implying that the European observers were a great help to the armies because they were highly skilled at war. These were professional soldiers, and so as a reader, we can assume that the Confederate and the Union armies wanted professional soldiers fighting on their side because it would increase their chances of winning. So for 3B, we would write down the author is implying that the European observers were a great help to the armies because they were highly skilled at war. All right, press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for part 4. we are looking for the title and caption that says Italian Volunteers. Let's read. Italian-born members of New York City's Garibaldi Guard wore uniforms that let everyone know their country of origin. Their broad-brimmed hats were decorated with rooster feathers. Such feathers are considered emblems of courage and are still worn on Italian military caps. So we're thinking about what the author is saying, and we know that the Italian troops wore rooster feathers in their caps because the feathers symbolize courage in Italian culture. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for 4B. And so we're thinking, like, what's the author doing? Why would the author include this picture and caption of the Italian volunteers with their feathers? And the author is showing us how an example of how a regiment of immigrants distinguished itself from the other regiments by adding to their uniform. And so the Italian volunteers, they celebrated the fact that they were immigrants and that they were considered different, and they celebrated it by putting these feathers in their hats. So let's write down our answer for 4B. The author is giving an example of how a regiment of immigrants distinguished itself from other regiments by adding to their uniform. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the paragraph. It says, what role did foreigners and immigrants play in the war? All right, and so you'll want to use box 1, your main idea, as your topic sentence. And then you can use one of the other boxes to support your statement. Make sure you have a quote from the text.